And for just a fleeting moment, a tiny wisp of time that hung in the air like fireflies in summer skies, she wondered if she was in love with him again. The timer went off in the kitchen, a small ding, and Noah turned away, breaking the moment, strangely affected by what had just happened between them. Her eyes had spoken to him and whispered something he longed to hear, yet he couldn't stop the voice inside his head, her voice, that had told him of her love for another man. He silently cursed the timer as he walked to the kitchen and removed the bread from the oven. He almost burned his fingers, dropped the loaf on the counter, and saw the frying pan was ready. He added the vegetables, heard them begin to crackle. Then, muttering to himself, he got some butter out of the icebox and spread some on the bread and melted a bit more for the crabs. Allie had followed him into the kitchen and cleared her voice. "Can I get the table ready?" "Sure. Plates are over there. Utensils, napkins, everything you need. Crabs can be messy, so we'll need a lot of napkins." He couldn't look at her as he spoke. He didn't want to realize he'd been mistaken about what had just happened between them. He didn't want it to be a mistake. Allie, too, was wondering about the moment and feeling warm as she thought of it. The words he'd spoken replayed in her head as she found everything she needed for the table plates, place setting, salt, pepper. Noah handed her the bread as she was finishing the table, and their fingers touched briefly. He turned his attention back to the frying pan. He lifted the lid of the steamer, saw the crabs still had a minute, and let them cook some more. He was more composed now and returned to small talk, easy conversation. "Have you ever had crab before?" "A couple of times, but only in salads." He laughed. "Then you're in for an adventure. Hold on a second." He disappeared upstairs for a moment and then returned with a navy blue button-down shirt. He held it open for her. "Here, put this on. I don't want you to stain your dress." Allie put it on and smelled the fragrance that lingered in the shirt. His smell, distinctive, natural. "Don't worry. It's clean." She laughed. "I know. It just reminds me of our really first date. You gave me your jacket that night, remember?" "Yeah, I remember. Finn and Sarah were with us. Finn kept elbowing me the whole way back to your parents' house, trying to get me to hold your hand." "You didn't, though?" "No." "Why not?" "Shy, maybe. Or afraid. I don't know. It just didn't seem like the right thing to do at the time." "Come to think of it, you were kind of shy, weren't you?" "I prefer the words quiet confidence," he answered with a wink, and she smiled. Vegetables and crabs were ready about the same time. "Be careful, they're hot," he said as he handed them to her, and they sat across from each other at the small wooden table. And then, realizing the tea was still on the counter, Allie stood and brought it over. Noah added a crab, and Allie sat for a moment staring at it. "It looks like a bug. A good bug, though. Here, let me show you how it's done." He demonstrated quickly, making it look easy, removing the meat, putting it on her plate. Allie crushed the legs too hard the first time, and the time after that, and had to use her fingers to get the shells away from the meat. She felt clumsy at first, worrying that he saw every mistake, but then she realized her own insecurity. He didn't care about things like that. He never had. "So whatever happened to Finn?" she asked. It took a second for him to answer. "Finn died in the war. His destroyer was torpedoed, in 43. "I'm sorry. I know he was a good friend of yours." His voice changed a little deeper now. "He was. I think of him a lot these days. I especially remember the last time I saw him. I'd come home to say goodbye before I enlisted, and we ran into each other again, and he was a banker here, like his daddy was, and he had spent a lot of time together over the next week, and sometimes I think I talked him into joining. I don't think he would have, except that I was going to. "Oh, that's not fair," she said. Sorry she'd brought up the subject. "You're right, I just miss him, that's all." I liked him, too. He made me laugh. He was always good at that. He had a crush on me, you know. I know. He told me about it. He did? What did he say? Well, the usual for him. That he had to fight you off with a stick, that you chased him constantly, that sort of thing. She laughed. Did you believe him? Of course. Why wouldn't I? You men always stick together. So tell me everything you've been up to since I saw you last, as she poked his arm with her finger. They started to talk then. Making up for lost time, Noah talked about leaving New Bern, about working in the shipyard at the scrapyard in New Jersey. He spoke fondly of Morris Goldman and touched on the war a little, avoiding most of the details, and told her about his father and how much he missed him. How much? Allie talked about going to college, painting, and her hours spent volunteering at the hospital. She talked about her family and friends and the charities she was involved with. Neither of them brought up anybody they had dated since they'd last seen each other. Even Lon was ignored, and though both of them noticed the omission, neither mentioned it. Afterward, Allie tried to remember the last time she and Lon had talked this way. Although he listened well, and they seldom argued, he was not the type of man to talk like this. Like her father, he wasn't comfortable sharing his thoughts and feelings. She tried to explain that she needed to be closer to him, but it never seemed to make a difference. But sitting here now, she realized what she'd been missing. The sky drew darker and the moon rose higher as the evening wore on, and without either of them being conscious of it, they began to regain the intimacy, the bond of familiarity they had once shared. They finished dinner, both pleased with the meal. Neither talking much now, Noah looked at his watch and saw that it was getting late. The stars were out in full, the crickets a little quieter. He had enjoyed talking to Allie, and wondered if he'd talked too much, wondered what she thought about his life, wondering, hoping it would somehow make a difference if it could. Noah got up, refilled the teapot. They both brought the dishes to the sink, cleaned up the table, and he poured 2 more cups of hot water, adding tea bags to both. "How about the porch again?" he asked, handing her the cup. He grabbed a quilt for her in case she got cold, and soon they had taken their places again, the quilt over her legs, rockers moving. Noah watched her from the corner of his eye. Oh, God. Oh, she's so beautiful, he thought. And inside, he ached, for something had happened during dinner. Quite simply, he had fallen in love again. He knew that now as they sat next to one another, fallen in love with a new Allie. Not just her memory. But then he had never really stopped, and this he realized, this was his destiny. It's been quite a night. Yes, it has, a wonderful night. Noah turned to the stars. This was the night he wanted never to end. How should he tell her? What could he say that would make her stay? He didn't know, and thus the decision was made to say nothing. And he realized then that he had failed. The rockers moved in quiet rhythm, bats again over the river, moths kissing the porch light. Somewhere, he knew, there were people making love. "Talk to me," she finally said. Her voice sensual? Or was his mind playing tricks? "What shall I say?" "Talk like you did to me," under the oak tree? And he did, reciting distant passages, toasting the night, Whitman and Thomas because he loved the images, Tennyson and Browning because their themes felt so familiar. She rested her head against the back of the rocker, closing her eyes, growing just a bit warmer by the time he'd finished. It wasn't just the poems or his voice this did it. No, it was all of it, the whole greater than the sum of the parts. She didn't try to break it down, didn't want to, because it wasn't meant to be listened to that way. Poetry, this thought, well, wasn't written to be analyzed. It was meant to inspire without reason, to touch without understanding. Because of him, she'd gone to a few poetry readings. She'd sat and listened to different people, different poems, but had stopped soon after, discouraged that no one inspired her or seemed as inspired as true lovers of poetry should be. They rocked for a while, drinking tea, sitting quietly. The compulsion that had driven her here was gone now. She was glad for this, but she worried about the feelings that had taken its place, the stirrings that had begun to sift and swirl in her pores like gold dust in river pans. She tried to deny them, hide from them, but now she realized that she didn't want them to stop. It had been years since she'd felt this way. Lon could not evoke these feelings in her. He never had and probably never would. Maybe that was why she had never been to bed with him. He had tried, before many times, using everything from flowers to guilt, but she had always used the excuse that she wanted to wait until marriage. He took it well, usually, and she sometimes wondered how hurt he would be if he ever found out about Noah. But there was something else that made her want to wait, and it had to do with Lon himself. He was driven in his work, and he always commanded most of his attention. Work came first, and for him, there was no time for poems and wasted evenings and rocking on porches. She knew this was why he was successful, and part of her respected him for that, but she also sensed it wasn't enough. She wanted something else, something different, something more. Passion and romance, perhaps, or maybe quiet conversations in candlelight rooms, or perhaps something as simple as not being second. Noah, too, was sifting through his thoughts. To him, the evening would be remembered as one of the most special times he had ever had. As he rocked, he remembered it all in detail, and then remembered it again. Everything she had done seemed somehow electric to him, charged. Now sitting beside her, he wondered if she'd ever dreamed the same things he had in the years they'd been apart. Had she ever dreamed of them holding each other again and kissing in soft moonlight? Or did she go further and dream of their naked bodies, which had been kept separate for far, far too long? He looked to the stars and remembered the thousands of empty nights he had spent since they'd last seen each other. Seeing her again brought all those feelings to the surface, and he found it impossible to press them back down. He knew then he wanted to make love to her again and to have her love in return. It was what he needed most in the world. But he also realized it could never be. Now that she was engaged, Allie knew by his silence that he was thinking about her and found that she reveled in it. She didn't know what his thoughts were exactly, didn't care really, just knew they were about her. And that was enough. She thought about their conversation at dinner and wondered about loneliness. For some reason, she couldn't picture him reading poetry to someone else or even sharing his dreams with another woman. He didn't seem the type. Either that or she didn't want to believe it. She put down the tea, then ran her hands through her hair and closing her eyes as she did so. "Are you tired?" "A little. I should really be going in a couple of minutes." "I know," he said. She didn't get up right away. Instead, she picked up the cup, drank the last of it, feeling it warm in her throat. She took the evening in. Moon higher now, wind in the trees, temperature dropping. She looked at Noah next. The scar on his face was visible from the side. She wondered if it had happened during the war, and then wondered if he'd ever been wounded at all. He hadn't mentioned it, and she hadn't asked, mostly because she didn't want to imagine him being hurt. I should go, she finally said, handing the quilt back to him. Noah nodded and then stood without a word. He carried the quilt, and the two of them walked to her car, crunching the leaves beneath their feet. She started to take off the shirt, but he said, "No, keep it. I want you to have it." She didn't ask why, because she wanted to keep it, too. She readjusted it and crossed her arms afterward to ward off the chill. For some reason, as she stood there, she was reminded of standing on her front porch after a high school dance, waiting for a kiss. "I had a great time tonight. Thank you. Thank you for finding me." "I did too." He summoned his courage. Well, I'll see you tomorrow." A simple question. She knew what the answer should be, especially if she wanted to keep her life simple. "I don't think we should," was all she had to say, and it would end right here and now. But for a second, she didn't say anything. The demon of choice confronted her then, teased her, challenged her. Why couldn't she say it? She didn't know. But as she looked in his eyes to find the answer she needed, she saw the man she'd once fallen in love with. And suddenly, it all came clear. "I'd like that." Noah was surprised. He hadn't expected that answer. He wanted to touch her then, to take her in his arms, but he didn't. "Can you be here about noon?" "Sure. What do you want to do?" "You'll see. I know just the place to go." "Have I ever been there before?" "Nope. But it's a special place." "Where is it?" "It's a surprise." "Will I like it?" "You'll love it," he said, and she turned away before he could attempt a kiss. She didn't know if he would try, but knew for some reason that if he did, she would have a hard time stopping him. She couldn't handle that right now. With everything going through her head, she slid behind the wheel, breathing a sigh of relief. He shut the door for her, and she turned the engine. And as the car idled, she rolled down the window just a bit. "See you tomorrow," she said, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. Noah waved as she backed the car out. She turned it around and then drove up the lane, heading toward town. He watched the car until the lights vanished behind far off oak trees and the engine noise was gone. After he looked up the road one last time, he and Clem, they returned to the back porch side by side. He sat in the rocker again, this time alone, trying once again to fathom the evening that had just passed. Thinking about it, replaying it, seeing it again, hearing it again, running it by in slow motion. He didn't feel like playing his guitar now, didn't feel like reading, didn't feel like poetry. Didn't know what he felt. "She's engaged," he finally whispered, and then was silent for hours. The night was quiet now, with little activity except for Clem, that sweet dog, who visited him occasionally, checking on him as if to ask, "Are you all right?" And sometime after midnight on that clear October evening, it all rushed inward, and Noah was overcome with longing. And if anyone had seen him, they would have seen what looked like an old man, someone who'd aged a lifetime in just a couple of hours, someone bent over in his rocker with his face in his hands and tears in his eyes. He didn't know how to stop them. Phone calls. Lon hung up the phone. He had called at 7, then at 8:30, and now he checked his watch again, 9:45. Where was she? He knew she was where she had said she would be, because he'd spoken to the manager earlier. Yes, she'd checked in. He had last seen her around 6, going to dinner, he thought. No, hadn't seen her since. Lon shook his head, leaned back in his chair. He was the last one in the office as usual, and everything was quiet, but that was normal with an ongoing trial. Law was his passion, and the late hours alone gave him the opportunity to catch up on his work without interruption. He knew he would win the case because he mastered the law and charmed the jury. He always did, and losses were infrequent now. Part of it came from being able to select the cases he had the expertise to win. He had reached that level in his practice. Only a select few in the city had that kind of stature, and his earnings reflected that. But the more important part of his success came from hard work. He had always paid attention to details, especially when he began his practice. Little things, obscure things, and it had become a habit now. Whether it was a matter of law or presentation, he was diligent in his study, and it had won him a few cases early in his career when he thought he should have lost. And now, a little detail bothered him. Not about the case, no, that was fine. It was something else, something about Allie. But damn, he couldn't put his finger on it. He was fine when she left this morning, at least he thought he was, but sometime after her call, maybe an hour or so, something clicked in his mind. The little detail. But what detail? What? Something insignificant? Something important? Think. Damn, what was it? His mind clicked. Something said. Something had been said. Yes, that was it. He knew it. But what was it? Had Allie said anything on the phone? That had been when it started. And he ran through the conversation again. No, nothing out of the ordinary. But that was it. He was sure now. What had she said? Her trip was good. She checked in, had done some shopping, left her number. That's about it. He thought about her then. He loved her. He was sure of that. Not only was she beautiful and charming, but she'd become his source of stability and best friend as well. After a hard day at work, she was the first person he would call. She would listen to him, laugh at the right moments, and had a sixth sense about what he needed to hear. But more than that, he admired the way she'd always spoken her mind. He remembered that after they'd gone out a few times, he said to her what he said to all women when, that he dated, that he wasn't ready for a steady relationship. And like the others, though, Allie had simply nodded and said, fine. But on her way out the door, she turned and said, but your problem isn't me or your job or your freedom or whatever else you think it is. Your problem is that you're alone. Your father made the Hammond name famous, and you've probably been compared to him all your life. You've never been your own person. A life like that makes you empty inside, and you're looking for someone who will magically fill that void, but no one can do that but you. The words had stayed with him that night and rang true the following morning. He'd called again, asked for a second chance. And after some persistence, she reluctantly agreed. Now, 4 years later, she'd become everything he ever wanted, and he knew he should spend more time with her, but practicing law made limiting his hours impossible. She'd always understood, but still, he cursed himself for not making the time. Once he was married, he'd shorten his hours. He promised himself he'd have his secretary check his schedule to make sure he wasn't overextending himself, and check. His mind clicked another dot. Check, checking in. He looked to the ceiling, checking in. Yes, that was it. He closed his eyes and thought for a second. No, nothing. What then? Come on, don't fail now. Think, damn it, think. New burn. New burn. He thought again. The little detail. And he knew the name, knew the town a little, mainly from a few trials he had been in. Stopped there a few times on the way to the coast, nothing special. He and Allie had never been there together, but Allie had been there before, and the rack tightened its grip. Another part coming together. Another part, but there was more. Allie, newborn, and something at a party. A comment in passing from Allie's mother. Oh, yes, he'd hardly noticed it. But what had she said? And Lon paled then, remembering what had been said so long ago, remembering what Allie's mother had said. It was something about Allie being in love one time with a young man from New Bern. Called it puppy love. So what, he had thought, when he'd heard it, and I'd turned to smile at Allie. But she hadn't smiled. She was angry. And then Lon guessed that she had loved that person far more deeply than her mother had suggested, maybe even more deeply than she loved him. And now she was there. Interesting. Lon brought his palms together as though he were praying, resting them against his lips. Coincidence? Could be nothing. Could be exactly what she said. Could be stress and antique shopping. Possible. Even probable. Yet what if? Lon considered the other possibility, and for the first time in a long time, he became frightened. What if? What if she's with him? He cursed the trial, wishing it were over, wishing he had gone with her, wondering if she'd told him the truth, hoping that she had. And he made up his mind then not to lose her. He would do anything it took to keep her. She was everything he'd always needed, and he'd never find another quite like her. So with trembling hands, he dialed the phone for the fourth and last time that evening. And again, there was no answer. Kayaks and forgotten dreams. Allie woke early the next morning, forced by the incessant chirping of starlings, and rubbed her eyes, feeling the stiffness in her body. She hadn't slept well, waking after every dream. She remembered seeing the hands of the clock in different positions during the night, as if verifying the passage of time. She'd slept in the soft shirt he'd given her, and she smelled him once again while thinking about the evening they'd spent together. The easy laughter and conversation came back to her, and she especially remembered the way he'd talked about her painting. It was so unexpected, yet uplifting. And as the words began to replay in her mind, she realized how sorry she would have been had she decided not to see him again. She looked out the window and watched the chattering birds search for food in every light. Noah, she knew, had always been a morning person. She knew he liked to kayak or canoe, and she remembered the one morning she'd spent with him in his canoe, watching the sun come up. She'd had to sneak out her window, to do it because her parents wouldn't allow it. But she hadn't been caught, and she remembered how Noah had slipped his arm around her and pulled her close as dawn began to unfold. "Look there," he'd whispered, and she'd watched her first sunrise with her head on his shoulder, wondering if anything could be better than what was happening at that moment. And as she got out of bed to take her bath, feeling the cold floor beneath her feet, she wondered if he'd been on the water this morning. Watching another day, thinking somehow he probably had. She was right. Noah was up before the sun and dressed quickly. He brushed the teeth before going downstairs, drank a quick glass of milk, grabbed 2 biscuits on the way out the door. After Clem greeted him with a couple of sloppy licks, he walked to the dock where his kayak was stored. He liked to let the river work its magic, loosening up his muscles, warming his body, clearing his mind. The old kayak, well used and river-stained, hung on 2 rusty hooks attached to his dock, just above the waterline to keep off the barnacles. He lifted it free from the hooks and set it at his feet, inspected it quickly, and then took it to the tank. In a couple of seasoned moves, long since mastered by habit, he had it in the water, working its way upstream, with himself as the pilot and engine. The air was cool on his skin, almost crisp, and the sky was a haze of different colors. Black directly above him like a mountain peak, then blues of infinite range, becoming lighter until it met the horizon where gray took its place. He took a few deep breaths, smelling pine trees and brackish water, and began to reflect. This had been part of what he'd missed most when he had lived up north. Because of the long hours at work, there had been little time to spend on the water. Camping, hiking, paddling on rivers, dating, working. Something had to go. For the most part, he'd been able to explore New Jersey's countryside on foot whenever he'd had extra time. But in 14 years, he hadn't canoed or kayaked once. There's something about, something, what can I say, special, almost mystical, about spending dawn on the water, he thought to himself, and he did it almost every day now. Sunny and clear or cold and bitter, it never mattered, as he paddled in rhythm to music in his head, working above water the color of iron. He saw a family of turtles resting on a partially submerged log and watched as a heron broke for flight, skimming just above the water before vanishing into the silver twilight that preceded sunrise. He paddled out to the middle of the creek, where he watched the orange glow begin to stretch across the water. He always liked to pause at daybreak. There was a moment when the view was spectacular, as if the world were being born again. Afterward, he began to paddle hard, working all the tension, preparing for the day. While he did that, questions danced in his mind like water drops in a frying pan. He wondered about Lon and what type of man he was, wondered about their relationship. Most of all, though, he wondered about Allie and why she had come. By the time he reached home, he felt renewed. Checking his watch, he was surprised to find that it had taken 2 hours. Time always played tricks out there. He hung the kayak to dry, stretched for a couple of minutes, and went to the shed where he stored his canoe. He carried it to the bank, leaving it a few feet from the water. As he turned toward the house, he noted that his legs were still a little stiff. The morning haze hadn't burned off yet, and he knew the stiffness in his legs usually predicted rain. He looked to the western sky and saw storm clouds, thick and heavy, far off, but definitely present. The winds weren't blowing hard, but they were bringing the clouds closer. From the looks of them, he didn't want to be outside when they got here. Damn, how much time did he have? A few hours, maybe more, maybe less. He showered, put on new jeans, red shirt, and black cowboy boots, brushed his hair, went downstairs to the kitchen. He did the dishes from the night before, picked up a little bit, went to the porch. The sky was darker now, and he checked the barometer. Steady, but it would start dropping soon. The western sky promised that. He'd learned long ago to never underestimate the weather, and he wondered if it was a good idea to go out. The rain he could deal with. Lightning was a different story, especially if he was on the water. A canoe was no place to be when electricity sparked in humid air. He finished coffee, putting off the decision until later, found his axe. After checking the blade by pressing his thumb to it, he sharpened it with a whetstone until it was ready. A dull axe is more dangerous than a sharp one, his daddy used to say. He spent the next 20 minutes splitting and stacking logs. He did it easily, his strokes efficient, and didn't break a sweat. He set a few logs off on the side for later and brought them inside. When he was finished, putting them by the fireplace, he looked at Allie's painting again and reached out to touch it, bringing back the feelings of disbelief at seeing her again. God, what was it about her that made him feel this way, even after all these years? What sort of power did she have over him? He finally turned away, shaking his head, and went back to the porch. The barometer hadn't changed, and then he looked at his watch. Allie should be here soon. Allie had finished her bath, was already dressed. She opened the window to check the temperature. It wasn't cold outside, and she decided on a cream-colored spring dress with long sleeves and a high neck. It was soft and comfortable, but it looked good, even if it was a little snug. And she had selected some white sandals that matched. She spent the morning walking around downtown. The Depression had taken its toll here, but she could see the signs of prosperity beginning to work their way back. The Masonic Theater, the oldest active theater in the country, looked a little more run down, but was still operating with a couple of recent movies. Fort Totten Park looked exactly the same as it had 14 years ago, and she assumed the kids who played on the swings after school looked the same as well. She smiled at the memory then, thinking back to when things were simpler, or at least it seemed to be. Now it seemed nothing was simple. It seemed so improbable, everything falling into place as it had, and she wondered what she would have been doing now had she never seen the article in the paper. It wasn't very difficult to imagine because her routine seldom changed. It was Wednesday, which meant bridge at the country club, then on to the Junior Women's League, where they would probably be arranging another fundraiser for the private school or the hospital. And after that, a visit with her mother, then home to get ready for dinner with Lon, because he made it a point to leave work by 7. It was the one night a week she saw him regularly. She suppressed a feeling of sadness about that, hoping that one day he would change. He had often promised to and usually followed through for a few weeks before drifting back to the same schedule. "I can't, honey, tonight. No," he would always explain. "I'm sorry, but I can't. Let me make it up to you later." She didn't like to argue with him about it, mostly because she knew he was telling the truth. Trial work was demanding, beforehand and during. Yet she couldn't help wondering sometimes why he had spent so much time courting her if he didn't want to spend the time with her now. She passed an art gallery, almost walked in. She paused at the door for a second, surprised at how long it had been since she'd been in one. At least 3 years, maybe longer. Why had she avoided it? She went inside. It had opened with the rest of the shops on Front Street and browsed among the paintings. Many of the artists were local, and there was a strong sea flavor to their work. Lots of ocean scenes, seagulls, but most of all, waves. Waves of every shape, size, and color imaginable, and after a while they all looked alike. The artists were either uninspired or lazy, she thought. On one wall, though, there were a few paintings that, more suited her taste. All were by an artist she'd never heard of, Allie, and most appeared to have been inspired by the architecture of the Greek islands. In the painting she liked the best, she noticed the artist had purposely exaggerated the scene with smaller-than-life figures, wide lines, and heavy sweeps of color, as if not completely focused. Yet the colors were vivid and swirling, drawing the eye in, almost directing it what it should be and see next. It was dynamic, dramatic. The more she thought about it, the more she liked it, and she considered buying it before she realized that she liked it because it reminded her of her own work. She examined it more closely and thought to herself that maybe Noah was right. Maybe she should start painting again. At 9:30, Allie left the gallery and went to Hoffman Lane. It took a few minutes to find what she was looking for. But there it was in the school supplies section. Paper, drawing chalk, pencils. Not high quality, but good enough. It wasn't painting, but it was a start. And she was excited by the time she got back to her room. She sat at the desk, started working. Nothing specific. Just getting the feel of it again. Letting shapes and colors flow from the memory of her youth. And after a few minutes of abstraction, she did a rough sketch of the street scene as seen from her room, amazed at how easily it came. It was almost as if she'd never stopped painting. She examined it when she was finished, pleased with the effort. She wondered what to try next and finally decided, since she didn't have a model, she visualized it in her head before starting, and though it was harder than the street scene, it came naturally and began to take form. Minutes passed quickly. She worked steadily. But she checked the time frequently so she wouldn't be late. And she finished it a little before noon. It had taken almost 2 hours, but the end result surprised her. It looked as though it had taken a great deal longer. And after rolling it up, she put it in a bag and collected the rest of her things. And on her way out the door, she looked at herself in the mirror, feeling oddly relaxed, not exactly sure why. And down the stairs again and out the door. And as she left, she heard a voice behind her. "Miss?" She turned, knowing it was directing at her, the manager. Same man as yesterday. "Yes?" "You had some calls last night." She was shocked. "I did?" "Yes, all from Mr. Hammond." "Oh, God." "Lon called?" "Yes, ma'am, 4 times. I talked to him when he called the second time. He was rather concerned about you, said he was your fiancé." She smiled weakly, trying to hide what she was thinking. 4 times. 4. What could that mean? What if something had happened back home? Did he say anything as if, an emergency? "He didn't really say, miss, but he didn't mention anything. Actually, he sounded more concerned about you, though." Good, she thought. That's good. And then just as suddenly, a pang in her chest. Why the urgency? Why so many calls? Has she said something yesterday? Why would he be so persistent? It was completely unlike him. Is there any way he could have found out? No, that was impossible, unless someone saw her here yesterday and called. But they would have had to follow her out to Noah's. No one would have done that. No one. She had to call him now. No way to get around it. But she didn't want to, strangely. This was her time, and she wanted to spend it doing what she wanted. She hadn't planned on speaking to him until later, and for some reason, she felt almost as if talking to him now would spoil the day. Besides, what was she going to say? How could she explain being out so late? A late dinner and then a walk? Maybe. Or a movie, or miss? Almost noon, she thought. Where would he be? His office, probably. No, in court. She suddenly realized and immediately felt as if she'd been released from shackles. There was no way she could talk to him, even if she wanted to. She was surprised by her feelings. She shouldn't feel this way, she knew, and yet it didn't bother her. She looked at her watch, acting now. Is it really almost 12? Yes, 11:45, actually. Unfortunately, he's in court right now, and I can't reach him. If he does call again, could you tell him I'm shopping and then I'll try to call him later? Of course. She could see the question in his eyes, though. But where were you last night? He had known exactly when she'd come in. Too late for a single woman in the small town, she was sure. Thank you. I'd appreciate it. And 2 minutes later, she was in her car, driving to Noah's, anticipating the day, largely unconcerned about the phone calls. Yesterday she would have been, and she wondered what that meant. As she was driving over the drawbridge, less than 4 minutes after she'd left the inn, Lon called from the courthouse. Moving water. Noah was sitting in his rocker drinking sweet tea, listening for the car, when he finally heard it turn up the drive. He went around front and watched the car pull up and park beneath the oak tree again. Same spot as yesterday. Clem barked a greeting at her car, tall, tail wagging, and he saw Allie wave from inside the car. She stepped out, patted Clem on the head while she cooed at her, and then turned, smiling at Noah as he walked toward her. She looked more relaxed than yesterday, more confident, and again he felt a slight shock at seeing her. It was different from yesterday, though, newer feelings now, not simply memories anymore. If anything, his attraction for her had grown stronger overnight, more intense, and made him a little nervous in her presence. After Allie met him halfway, carrying a small bag in one hand, she surprised him by kissing him gently on the cheek, her free hand lingering at his waist after she pulled back. "Hi, where's the surprise?" she said, radiance in her eyes. He relaxed a little, thanking God for that. "Not even a good afternoon, or how was your night?" She smiled. Patience had never been one of her strongest attributes. "Fine. Good afternoon. How was your night? And where's the surprise?" He chuckled. "Allie, I've got some bad news." "What?" "I was going to take you someplace, but with those clouds coming in, I'm not sure we should go." "Why?" "The storm. We'll be outside and might get wet. Besides, there might be lightning." "It's not raining yet. How far is it?" "Up the creek about a mile. And I've never been there before." "Not when it was like this." She thought for a second while she looked around. "Then we'll go. I don't care if it rains." "Are you sure?" "Absolutely." He looked at the clouds again, noting their approach. "Then we better go now. Can I bring that in for you?" She handed her bag to him, and he jogged to the house, replaced it in a chair, and then he grabbed some bread and put it in a bag, bringing it with him, and they walked to the canoe, Allie beside him, a little closer than yesterday. "What exactly is this place?" "You'll see." "You're not even going to give me a hint?" "Well, do you remember when we took the canoe out and watched the sun come up?" "I thought about it this morning. I remember it made me cry." "What you're going to see today makes what you saw then seem ordinary." "I guess I should feel special." "You are special," he finally said. And the way he said it made her wonder if he wanted to add something else, but he didn't. And Allie smiled a little before glancing away. As she did, she felt the wind in her face and noticed it had picked up since the morning. They reached the dock a moment later. After tossing the bag in the canoe, Noah quickly checked to make sure he hadn't missed anything, and then he slid the canoe in the water. "Can I do anything?" "Nope. Just get in." And after she climbed in, he pushed the canoe farther into the water, close to the dock. Then he gracefully stepped off the dock into the canoe, placing his feet carefully to prevent the canoe from capsizing. Allie was impressed by his agility, knowing that what he had done so quickly and easily was harder than it looked. Allie sat at the front of the canoe, facing backward. He had said something about missing the view when he started to paddle, but she'd shaken her head, saying she was fine the way she was. And it was true. She could see everything she really wanted to see if she turned her head. But most of all, she wanted to watch Noah. It was him she'd come to see, not the creek. His shirt was unbuttoned at the top, and she could see his chest muscles flex. His sleeves were rolled up, too, and she could see the muscles in his arms bulging ever so slightly. His muscles were well developed, there from paddling every morning, she was sure. Artistic, she thought. There's something almost artistic about him when he does this. Something natural, as if being on the water were beyond his control. Part of a gene passed on to him from some obscure hereditary glow. When she watched him, she was reminded of how the early explorers must have looked when they'd first discovered this area. She couldn't think of anyone else who remotely resembled him. He was complicated, almost contradictory in so many ways, yet simple, a strangely erotic combination. On the surface, he was a country boy, home from war. He probably saw himself in those terms, yet there was so much more to him. Perhaps it was the poetry that made him different, or perhaps it was the values his father had instilled in him growing up. Either way, he seemed to savor life more fully than others appeared to, and that's what had first attracted her to him. What are you thinking? She felt her insides jump a bit as Noah's voice brought her back to the present. She appreciated the silence he'd allowed her. He'd always been considerate like that. Good things, she answered, and saw in his eyes that he knew she was thinking about him. She liked the fact that he knew it, and she hoped he had been thinking about her as well. She understood then that something was stirring within her, as it had so many years ago. Watching his body move, made her feel it. And as their eyes lingered for a second, she felt the heat in her neck and breasts, and she flushed, turning away before he noticed. How much further? Another half mile or so. Not any more than that. It's pretty out here, so clean, so quiet. It's almost like, I don't know, going back in time. In a way it is, I think. The creek flows from the forest. There's not a single farm between here and where it starts. And the water is pure as rain. It's probably as pure as it's ever been. Tell me, Noah, what do you remember most from the summer we spent together? All of it. Anything in particular? No. You don't remember? No, it's not that. It's not what you're thinking. I was serious when I said all of it. I can remember every moment we were together, and each of them, there was something wonderful. I can't really pick out any one that means more than any other. The entire summer was perfect. The kind of summer everyone should have. How could I pick one moment over another? Poets often describe love as an emotion that we can't control, one that overwhelms logic and common sense. That's what it was like for me. I didn't plan on falling in love with you, and I doubt if you planned on falling in love with me. But once we met, it was clear that neither of us could control what was happening to us. We fell in love, despite our differences. And once we did, something rare and beautiful was created. For me, love like that had happened only once, and that's why every minute we spent together has been seared in my memory. I'll never forget a single moment of it. Allie stared at him. No one had ever said anything like that to her before, ever. And she didn't know what to say and stayed silent, her face hot. I'm sorry if I made you feel uncomfortable, Allie. I didn't mean to. But that summer has stayed with me and probably always will. I know it can't be the same between us, but that doesn't change the way I felt about you then. She spoke quietly. It didn't make me uncomfortable, Noah. It's just that I don't ever hear things like that. What you said was beautiful. It takes a poet to talk the way you do. And like I said, you're the only poet I've ever met. Peaceful silence descended on them. A mullet splashed near the bank. The paddle moved rhythmically, causing baffles that rocked the boat ever so slightly. The breeze had stopped and the clouds grew thicker and blacker as the canoe moved toward some unknown destination. Allie noticed it all, every sound, every thought. Her senses had come alive, invigorating her, and she felt her mind drifting through the last few weeks. She thought about the anxiety coming here and how much unease it had caused her. The shock at seeing the article, the sleepless nights, her short temper during daylight. From yesterday, she had been afraid and wanted to run away. The tension was gone now. Every bit of it, replaced by something else, and she was glad about that. As she rode in silence in the old red canoe, she felt strangely satisfied that she'd come, pleased that Noah had turned into the type of man she thought he would, pleased that she would have and live forever with that knowledge. She had seen too many men in the past few years destroyed by war or time or even money. It took strength to hold on to inner passion, and Noah had done that. This was a worker's world, not a poet's, and people would have a hard time understanding Noah. America was in full swing now. All the papers said so, and people were rushing forward, leaving behind the horrors of war. She understood the reasons, but they were rushing, like Lon, toward long hours and profits, neglecting the things that brought beauty to the world. Who did she know in Raleigh who took time off to fix a house? Or read Whitman or Eliot, finding images in the mind, thoughts of the spirit, or hunted dawn from the bow of a canoe. These weren't the things that drove society, but she felt that they shouldn't be treated as unimportant. They made living worthwhile. To her, it was the same with art, though she had realized it only upon coming here, or rather remembered it. She had known it once before, and again she cursed herself for getting something as important as creating beauty. Painting was what she was meant to do. She was sure of that now. Her feelings this morning had confirmed it, and she knew that whatever happened, she was going to give it another shot. A fair shot, no matter what anyone said. Would Lon encourage her painting? She remembered showing him one of her paintings a couple of months after they had started, going out. It was an abstract painting. It was meant to inspire thought. In a way, it resembled the painting above Noah's fireplace, the one Noah understood completely, though it may have been a touch less passionate. Lon had stared at it, studied it almost, and then had asked her what it was supposed to be. She hadn't bothered to answer.